The Chernobyl disaster caused widespread devastation. Fish swelled and died, animals were born twisted and deformed, and the firefighters who tried to stop it were burned from the inside out. People were kicked out of their homes overnight, entire towns bulldozed and buried, and there are photographs of almost all of it. These are more disturbing photos taken inside Chernobyl after the disaster. This is the very first photo ever taken of the Chernobyl reactor after the explosion. April 27th, 1986, around 4 p.m., almost 14 hours after it blew. The man who took it was Igor Kostin, a photojournalist from Kiev who flew in on the first helicopter sent to survey the site. He didn't know it yet, but just being there probably gave him a fatal dose of radiation. The foggy look of the photo is not caused by fog, it's radiation. The film itself was being damaged as he shot it. Even standing at the helicopter window was dangerous, which is why the photo was taken from a distance and slightly off angle. At about 200 meters above the reactor, radiation levels hit around 1500 rems. Rem is just a way to measure how much radiation your body absorbs and how badly it can hurt you. 1 rem might give you a tiny chance of getting sick later, 100 rem will make most people seriously ill, and 400 to 500 is enough to kill about half of the people exposed in a month. So 1500 rems, that is insanely high, enough to kill someone in just a few minutes. The helicopter crew wasn't shielded from it, and even the instruments on board maxed out at 500 rems, so they didn't even realize how deadly this was. The air was literally hot enough to start frying their bodies from the inside out, and many of the crew on that flight later got sick from radiation exposure. This image was taken in 1989, a woman holding up a newborn pig that obviously was not born healthy, a clear victim of radioactive fallout. It is grotesque to say the least. One of those images that just makes you want to take a shower after seeing it. I don't really have a lot to say about this image other than it's a very raw photo of the direct effect the disaster had and still has on the animals living in the exclusion zone. You don't need any context to know something went horribly wrong here either. This is a truly nightmarish image. A man lies in a hospital bed covered in thick bandages. You can't even see his face, it's just layers of gauze. You'll also notice he has these metal hoops around his hands holding his fingers apart. Yeah, that's so his skin doesn't tear or stick. He was one of the firefighters from Chernobyl, flown to hospital number 6 in Moscow right after the explosion. The doctors there said the radiation burns were unlike anything they'd ever seen. Not normal burns from heat, but cell death from the inside out. It's hard to find information on this photo specifically. Not exactly sure who it is, but again, it was one of the firefighters who fought the blaze on the reactor roof, possibly 27-year-old V.I. Starvoit. He had burns over a third of his body and needed to be kept in total isolation because his skin itself was radioactive. Unbelievably horrifying. This is another photo taken by Igor Kostin. These fish were collected from a small artificial lake inside the Chernobyl site, which was used to cool the reactor's turbines. These fish died from radiation exposure. They are abnormally large, bloated, and flabby. Some had just jumped out of the water, making them easy to pick up by hand. It's a clearer snapshot of how radiation affected animal life almost immediately after the disaster. The lake was supposed to be part of the plant's cooling system, but after the explosion, it became a toxic death trap, killing everything in it. This was happening everywhere. Rivers, lakes, and soil around Chernobyl were exposed to massive amounts of radiation, causing mutations and massive die-offs of animals. We've mentioned Igor Kostin a couple times now, so let's talk more about him. Igor Fedorovich Kostin was one of the only 5 photographers in the world to actually capture the Chernobyl disaster up close. At the time, he was working for the Novosti press agency in Kiev, and he rushed to the site to document what was happening. His aerial shots of the nuclear plant, showing the full scale of the destruction, were published around the world and instantly terrified people, especially since Soviet media was barely saying anything. They didn't start releasing official information until 2 days later, and even then, they're still trying to downplay things. Kostin didn't just take dramatic photos of the explosion or the plant though. He went again and again to document the aftermath. He photographed cleanup crews, animals, and of course, the everyday people who were being affected, patients in hospitals, people being evacuated, whatever he could. He put himself at serious risk, of course, every time he went back, eventually absorbing 5 times the safe limit of radiation and developing health issues later on. He continued his work for years though, trying to show the world the real cost of the disaster. Kostin died in a car accident in Kiev in 2015 at 78. But he left behind all these incredible raw images that pulled back the curtain on one of the worst nuclear disasters in history. Pictured here are Oksana Gaibon and Alla Kazmirka, both victims of the disaster, receiving infrared radiation treatment at the Terrera Children's Hospital in Havana, Cuba in 1994. Doctors experimented with infrared lamps to treat radiation burns on Chernobyl victims. The idea was to help damaged skin heal faster using heat and light to, in theory, help stimulate blood flow and tissue repair. It was not a standard treatment, and it wasn't really proved to actually help anything. Doctors were just kind of trying anything they could. Most care focused on preventing infections, treating burns with dressings and medications, and in severe cases, bone marrow transplants. Along the Prypiat River, a whole line of boats was left behind after the evacuation. Some were small ferries that moved workers back and forth to the plant. Others were service boats used for hauling equipment or fuel. When the fallout hit, the boats were already exposed, so they were basically written off. There was no point trying to save them. They were contaminated, and the priority was, of course, clearing people, not equipment. So over time, they just sat rotting. Some stayed tied to their docks until the ropes gave way. Others drifted a little, got stuck in mud, or sank just enough that only the top half still sits above the water. You can walk along the shoreline and see them rusting in different stages, peeling paint, collapsed decks, broken windows, metal flaking off. One of the most recognizable is a sightseeing boat that used to take people on little cruises along the river. Now it's just sitting there, tilted on its side, slowly falling apart. And these eerie images are what are often called shadow people. You can find these black silhouettes painted all over the exclusion zone, on walls and stairwells, doorways. They were added years after the evacuation by artists visiting the site. The shapes show kids, adults, and workers, people who used to be everywhere before the city was abandoned. They're not memorials or official markers, but it does help fill the empty spaces left behind. It gives a sense of presence to the people who were forced to leave. They're a little eerie, but it does add this somber beauty to the place too. Here we see the red forest being cleaned up. The dead radioactive trees were cut down and soil was disturbed. Dust containing radioactive particles could easily get picked up by wind and then spread to other areas. So to help stop that, crews sprayed the cleared area with a special solution, basically a type of liquid that soaks into the soil and debris. The solution helps bind the radioactive particles together, keeping them from flying up into the air. It doesn't remove the radiation, but it reduces the risk of it spreading, at least. The red forest is the area right next to the Chernobyl reactor, where the explosion and fallout killed thousands of pine trees almost instantly, turning the needles this reddish brown. After the disaster, the forest became one of the most radioactive places on Earth. Cleanup crews had to go in wearing full protective gear, cutting down trees, raking contaminated soil, and burying it in trenches. The work was dangerous. Every piece of debris, every tree, every scoop of soil was just full of contamination. They used bulldozers and trucks to remove the dead trees and bury radioactive material, creating huge piles of waste covered with sand and concrete. And even decades later, this forest is still highly radioactive. And finally, in this photo, 2 liquidators are walking through a field inside the exclusion zone. They're wearing those bulky anti-chemical suits and pig muzzle masks. The suits look protective, but they didn't actually do much to shield them from the kind of radiation they were surrounded by. They're mostly meant to keep radioactive dust off their skin, not stop the radiation itself. They're holding these older style radiation counters, equipment that was already outdated by the time the accident happened. It, of course, wasn't ideal for measuring fast changing levels out in open fields, but it was all they had. Their job was to check the soil and the young plants to see how much contamination had settled there. Plants in the field weren't going to be harvested or eaten, of course. Scientists kept sections of land like this untouched so they could track how radiation was affecting the plants and soil over time. The people sent in to clean up Chernobyl's radioactive mess barely survived the work, and some didn't. A massive blob of radioactive material sits under the plant, so deadly that just standing near it for a minute could kill, and black fungus is growing inside the abandoned reactor, feeding on the radiation itself. These are disturbing photos taken inside Chernobyl after the disaster. In 1986, right after the Chernobyl disaster, a group of people known as the Liquidators were called in to clean up the radioactive mess. This photo shows some of them at work, and if you look closely at the bottom, you'll see these strange white streaks on the film. Those are actually caused by radiation. A lot of these workers were not trained specifically for this type of work. Some were firefighters and soldiers, but there were also regular people thrown into the fire. They didn't have much protective gear, so some of them had to improvise with whatever they could find, like leather and lead plates. They worked in insane conditions, dealing with radiation levels that would have made most people collapse, and a lot of them ended up seriously sick later. Some died from exposure, and despite all that, they kept going, trying to contain one of the worst nuclear disasters in history. This photo shows one of the most infamous spots inside Chernobyl, the Elephant's Foot. Right after the 1986 explosion, a lot of the molten reactor core sank beneath the plant, and what formed was this massive wrinkled blob of radioactive sludge made from melted fuel, metal, sand, and concrete. It got its name because, as you can probably tell, it kind of looks like the thick, wrinkly skin of an elephant. Back when it first formed, it was insanely deadly. Just standing nearby for a few minutes would kill you. To even get a picture, people had to bounce cameras off mirrors so no one had to actually get too close. The heat was so intense it was literally burning through the floors beneath it. Nowadays it's cooled down and isn't instantly lethal, but it's still one of the most radioactive things on planet Earth, sealed off deep in the plant. What you're looking at here is a black fungus that's been growing in various parts of Chernobyl. It grows toward radiation. The fungus is called, let me see if I can pronounce this right, Cladosporium sphaerospermum. This is a photo of it spreading on the walls of the reactor's damaged areas. It contains melanin, the same pigment that gives human skin its color, but in this case, it seems to help the fungus feed on radiation. It's almost like it's photosynthesizing, except instead of sunlight, it's using deadly gamma rays to grow. Experiments have shown that the fungus actually grows faster when exposed to radiation. Most life would die instantly in that environment, but this stuff is growing just fine. Scientists are now looking at it as a potential tool for radiation protection, maybe even for astronauts on long space missions where radiation is, of course, a huge problem. This is a comparison between what frogs are supposed to look like in the forest of Chernobyl and what they look like now. Parts of Chernobyl, scientists discovered something really unusual: eastern tree frogs with completely black skin. Normally these frogs are green or maybe brownish, but in radioactive zones a lot of them had turned jet black, a condition called melanism. Researchers think the frogs are producing extra melanin to protect themselves from harmful UV rays or even radiation. They're still not entirely sure whether radiation triggered genetic changes or just made the frogs crank out more melanin, but it's obvious the disaster played a role. When word of the accident got out, it got out. This was international news, and scientists from around the world wanted to know how bad the contamination really was. Journalists and researchers started taking soil, water, and air samples near Chernobyl to test them independently. Of course, the Soviets hated this because they wanted to keep the scale of the disaster quiet, so the KGB actually set up operations to swap out samples. Yes, for example, in 1987, a French journalist came to investigate and tried to collect soil and water samples. The KGB intercepted him, swapping his samples with clean ones. They also faked data in official reports downplaying the radiation levels to make it seem safer than it really was. I mean, it sounds totally conspiratorial, but no, declassified KGB documents did confirm that this was going on. It's part of why, for years, people outside the USSR had no idea how much radiation had actually spread across other parts of Europe. Even countries like Sweden and Germany, which detected the fallout, had to piece the truth together on their own, because the Soviets were covering their tracks. Radiation didn't just hit the soil around the plant, it contaminated crops, livestock, fish, pretty much everything people were eating. The government tried to set up food checkpoints to keep radioactive food off the market, but I mean, nothing is foolproof. Farmers and vendors who didn't want to lose money could bribe inspectors to keep selling their tainted produce. Bread made from contaminated grain, meat from exposed animals. All of it ended up in people's homes, and some of it was shipped to other parts of the Soviet Union, so people hundreds of miles away were eating this stuff. The problem is radiation doesn't change the way food looks, or tastes? How was anyone really supposed to know? They just trusted what they were buying at the market. Years later, reports started coming out about people developing thyroid cancer and other illnesses, and a lot of that traces back to eating food that should have never been sold in the first place. The first people hit hardest by the explosion were the plant workers, obviously, and firefighters who rushed to the scene. They were exposed to radiation doses so high that some died within just weeks from what's known as acute radiation syndrome, which causes burns, organ failure, and internal bleeding. The Soviet government reported almost none of this. Officially, only 31 people were listed as immediate deaths. This was the official number for years. In reality, hospital wards in Moscow were packed with men who'd been at the reactor site, a lot of them dying slow, painful deaths that never made it into official statistics. And in the years that followed, thousands of cases of thyroid cancer, especially in children, started showing up across Ukraine and Belarus. Doctors who tried to tie these illnesses to Chernobyl were often ignored or silenced. Families were told their loved ones died of pneumonia or heart failure, not radiation sickness. Even today, there's still no universally agreed upon death toll. Could be a few thousand, could be hundreds of thousands. It's hard because a lot of these are cancer cases. One of the biggest things that made Chernobyl so much worse was how unprepared everyone was. I mean, we already established that inside the plant there were known problems, but operators had been bending the rules to keep things running. But when the reactor finally blew, the people who rushed in to deal with it weren't even given the right protective gear. Firefighters were sent in wearing nothing but their regular uniforms, spraying water and radioactive material that was burning at insane temperatures. Nobody told them what they were actually up against. Some workers at the plant were ordered to shovel radioactive debris with their bare hands, wearing only cotton clothing. By the time doctors in nearby hospitals started seeing patients, they realized these men weren't just burned from fire, they were showing the classic signs of radiation poisoning. We've mentioned them before in this video, but the Soviet secret police, the KGB, played a huge role in making sure the outside world and their own citizens didn't get the full truth about Chernobyl. Right after the explosion, they were the ones managing what newspapers could print, what TV could report, and what foreign journalists were allowed to see. If soil or water samples came back showing dangerous levels of radiation, the KGB could swap them out or bury the results. They also watched over doctors and scientists, making sure nobody went public with data that showed just how widespread the contamination really was. Inside the USSR, people only heard what the KGB approved, which at first was basically everything's under control. Outside the USSR, they worked just as hard to downplay the scale of it, treating it like a minor industrial accident instead of, again, the worst nuclear disaster in history.
Starting us off at number 10 are Dewey's old favorite, dolls. Remember this one? Yeah, so in case you missed a few of our other Chernobyl videos, there are large piles of creepy, most likely possessed, burned up, radioactive dolls everywhere. Where are they coming from? Well, odds are most of these are actually coming from tourists and people looking to grab that one spooky and scary pic for the gram, but no one knows how this all came to be. It's hard to know if this started from actual dolls that witnessed the explosion or if someone just had the bright idea one day to start adding messed up dolls all over the exclusion zone. In the end, we will never know because unless you are a regular there at the exclusion zone, it's hard to distinguish which dolls have been there since day one and which ones are new additions. Either way, I hate all of it. At number 9, we have missing silver filters. Remember those pile of creepy dolls? Yeah, of course you do, it literally just freaking happened. Well, in addition to the piles of dead dolls, there are also piles of old gas masks everywhere, especially in one old school classroom. Some cheeky and hilarious, sick person even put some of these masks on dolls. Isn't that great? Anyway, what is mysterious about these gas masks is that these filters inside of all of them have been removed. And these filters contain just a small amount of silver in them, and what is most likely what happened is that looters came and took all of them. But what was done with the silver? No one really knows. If looters did indeed steal them, then I'm guessing that somewhere out there some people have radioactive jewelry or even silverware because they most likely sold it. It's hard to say, but if any of you watching have your own Geiger meters at home right now, I would check it out on anything silver in your home because you might just have a Chernobyl souvenir without even knowing it. At number 8, we have survivor immortality. While this one doesn't take place in Chernobyl exactly, it stems from Chernobyl. One Russian scientist who survived the explosion back in 1986 and 6 other Russian scientists have recently relocated to the small Greek island of Gavdos. There is some conspiracy though, because some believe that these scientists actually relocated to the island to become immortal. Gavdos has 50 residents in total on the island, and it is believed to have mythical healing powers that make its residents immortal. Reporters from Vice interviewed a filmmaker who was making a documentary on the island and found out that the scientists work on various inventions from inside the local compound. They also have 7 acres of land that was given to them by a priest. Some think these Russian scientists are spies, while others believe they moved out there to not only become immortal themselves, but also clear them of all the radiation using the mystical powers of the island. They are apparently also building a temple named the Temple of Apollo. I think these guys were a little too close to the blast, if you know what I mean. At number 7, we have the random examination chair. Out in the middle of a wooded area in the exclusion zone is a random gynecologist's chair. How the hell did it get there? No one freaking knows. It can only be assumed that this chair was picked up by some local pranksters who went through the trouble of picking up this radioactive artifact and brought it to a random spot in the woods. But that is so much freaking work. I mean, guys, why? Aside from that, every other possibility is straight up terrifying. Maybe the blast blasted the chair out in the forest, but if it did, then why was there one of these chairs so close to a freaking radioactive reactor? See, it doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So it's just another unproven, less than appealing sight that can be found in the exclusion zone. At number 6, we have silhouettes. You may remember this one from one of my other Chernobyl videos too. The mystery here is we have no idea if these silhouettes are actually based on real people or if it's just a morbid art piece done by another Chernobyl creepy artist. New silhouettes show up all of the time, all over the town of Prypiat, and the only other mystery here is who is behind it. Is it one talented artist, or is it a group that has decided to take turns so no one ever gets the true answer? No matter what, these things sure do add to the creep factor of this ghost town, and I'm sure it's also a terrifying sight to see at night.
In our number 5 spot today, we have The Pilot. This is another first-hand account from right after the disaster, and this one comes from Igor Kostin, who was a helicopter navigator following the disaster. After the meltdown, helicopter crews were sent out to try and spread decontamination materials over the site. One of these crews was actually killed trying to do this work after they crashed at the site. Of the disaster, Igor said, quote, "They told us there had been an explosion at the plant, so they needed our help. The mission was, after the firemen, to drop down loads of stuff from helicopters to the destroyed reactor. First sand, then lead, dolomite, boron. We would load up about 15 kilometers distance from the reactor. They would put sandbags into parachutes, then we would take off and pass around in a conveyor fashion. There would be a circle of up to 40 helicopters in the air, which would fly over and right above the reactor every 2 to 3 minutes. No one opened the windows. The chopper was all shut, but it was not airtight. It was not protected against radiation. The view of the destroyed reactor down below, after the main fire had been put out, you could see separate glowing reddish fire beds in the first days. This was the view from the height of 200 meters. Of course, we knew this was dangerous, but what we did not have was adequate protective gear for the mission, but that's the responsibility of those who sent us there. Radiation is considered invisible. It cannot be seen, but you can feel it. That is, you can feel a certain metallic taste in your mouth and a sore throat. Radiation never passes without a trace, so the consequences are always there, and radiation usually hits precisely those parts of the body that are the most vulnerable. So for everyone who's gone through Chernobyl, there are consequences. I remember so well the first time we flew over Prypiat town. The whole town had been evacuated by then, but everything looked sort of surreal. Linen is hanging on laundry lines, on balconies, you see dropped bicycles, abandoned cars, no life around, all people gone, but their stuff is still there. When the catastrophe happened, there was the Soviet Union. We had 15 constituent republics playing their part in handling this mess. Today, no country in the world would be in a position to handle the problem of this magnitude if it happened again. In our number 4 spot today, we have the elephant's foot. The elephant's foot is a highly radioactive mass of corium that was formed during the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. It is named after its shape, which resembles that of an elephant's foot. The corium was formed when the reactor's core melted down, causing a mixture of melted nuclear fuel, concrete, and other materials to form into a highly radioactive mass. The elephant's foot is estimated to have had a temperature of around 2,000 700 degrees Celsius at the time of the accident and emitted lethal levels of radiation. The initial workers who tried to remove the elephant's foot from the reactor died within weeks due to the radiation exposure. Today, the elephant's foot remains extremely radioactive and is still inaccessible. It is estimated to be one of the most dangerous objects in the world, with exposure to it resulting in almost certain death within minutes. In our number 3 spot today, we have Kopachi. Kopachi was a village in Ukraine that was affected by the disaster. The village was situated close to the nuclear power plant, and its residents were exposed to high levels of radiation. To contain the spread of contamination, the Soviet government ordered the evacuation and burial of the village, including burying the contaminated soil under a layer of clean soil. Today, Kopachi remains abandoned and designated as a part of the exclusion zone around the Chernobyl plant. The village and surrounding area serve as a reminder of the devastating consequences of nuclear disasters and the importance of nuclear safety. In our number 2 spot today, we have the plant. It might come as a surprise, but the Chernobyl nuclear plant didn't just shut down entirely after the disaster. Despite the contamination and the risks associated, they continued to use the plant for years to come. Reactor 4, which exploded during the accident, was completely destroyed, and the other reactors were shut down over time. The Soviet government continued to use parts of the plant for several years to generate electricity and heat for the surrounding area, but eventually the plant was decommissioned. It wasn't until December of 2000 that the final reactor, Reactor 3, was shut down. Reactor 2 was shut down in 1991, and 1 was shut down in 1996. It is thought that the plant should be fully out of use by 2028. And finally, in our number 1 spot today, we have the containment. After the disaster took place, the damaged reactor, Reactor number 4, was sealed in a heavy concrete sarcophagus that was meant to keep the radiation concealed and contained. While this may seem like a foolproof plan, there are many debates about how effective this containment actually is and how effective it may or may not continue to be. These are, of course, super important questions, and considering the fact that it's something we've never really had to deal with before in any way, how are we really supposed to know until we try? The building of a new structure called the New Safe Confinement Structure started in 2006, and it was completed in 2017. The new structure is 843 feet wide, 531 feet long, and 356 feet tall, and is meant to keep the reactor and its previous sarcophagus contained for at least the next 100 years. Despite that relatively short amount of time, experts say that the exclusion zone and surrounding area will remain uninhabitable for the next 20,000 years.
And yet another photo snapped by Igor Kostin. This is the funeral of Alexander Goryev in 1988. He was one of the liquidators who worked on the roof of Reactor 3, the guys they called roof cats, because they were sent up onto the reactors where the radiation was the worst. Goryev ended up dying from a radiation-related illness, one of the many who didn't make it long after the cleanup. These people bravely climbed onto the most radioactive parts of the plant, often with barely any protection. Radiation followed them home, made them sick, and killed them, some almost immediately, others years later. Here's a disturbing image. This is a photo of a member of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences holding a mutated colt. The foal was nicknamed the Gorbachev Colt, after a life-size photo of it was sent to Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev in 1988 to show the effects that the Chernobyl disaster was having on the wildlife. Take a look at its feet. You notice how twisted and deformed they are. Ugh. We hear a lot about animals being mutated by radiation, but I mean, actually seeing physical evidence of it like this, man, it just hits on a whole other level. And this was not a rare occurrence. Birds, cows, insects, as we mentioned earlier, pigs, were all being born with deformities across the zone. There are a few haunting photos showing the evacuations from Prypiat and the surrounding areas after the explosion. On April 27, 1986, around 49,000 people were told to leave. At the time, they were being told it would just be temporary. Buses and trucks arrived to get everyone out, and you notice how no one is wearing gas masks. Supposedly, they didn't tell people to. If they did, everyone would know how bad the situation really was, and like I said, they were trying to still downplay everything. People left almost everything behind. They were told to just bring their documents and a few personal belongings. Pets, farm animals were abandoned, and the areas were quickly sealed off. Over the next few weeks, tens of thousands more were evacuated from towns within the 30-kilometer exclusion zone, eventually moving over 116,000 people. Many never returned, but some actually did. They're called samosli, which just means self-settlers. Most are older people who didn't want to leave their homes, farms, and villages behind. It was just all they knew. But some couldn't return to their homes even if they wanted to. This photo shows something most people never realize happened after Chernobyl. They had to bury entire towns. This bulldozer is digging a trench that that house there is about to be pushed into. When radiation spread, the Soviet cleanup crews were told to destroy anything that couldn't be decontaminated. Homes, barns, schools. They'd go from village to village, painting big X's on buildings that were just lost causes. And the bulldozers came in, they'd crush the walls, dump the rubble into a pit. In some places, they even poured concrete over it. This photograph was taken in Hospital Number 6 in Moscow, the main facility that treated Chernobyl's radiation victims. After the explosion, dozens of firefighters and plant workers were flown there immediately, many of them barely conscious. The hospital had a special radiation unit run by Dr. Angelina Goskova and Dr. Robert Gale, who were forced to kind of improvise treatments that didn't really exist yet. They had to isolate the patients completely because even their sweat and breath could contaminate anyone nearby. So in this photo, you see a doctor working through a plastic wall using long gloves, treating a patient who'd already had a bone marrow transplant, the last-ditch effort to replace cells destroyed by radiation. These transplants rarely actually worked. Most patients' immune systems were just too damaged to recover, and infections would set in within days. Some of them didn't even survive long enough for their hair to fall out. They were gone within 2 weeks. Hospital Number 6 was full of scenes like this. Rooms sealed off, nurses wearing full protective suits, patients whose skin had started to peel from radiation burns. Visitors weren't allowed, and even doctors had to limit their time near the beds. A man in a gas mask pushing a stroller out of the contaminated zone. What was in it? You'll be shocked to find out. A metal cloth so radioactive it can deliver a lethal dose in minutes, vegetables dumped in landfills across Europe, and boats rotting along the Prypiat River. These are more disturbing photos taken inside Chernobyl after the disaster. This image may not look all that striking at first, but there's an interesting backstory here. Months after the disaster, the Soviets wanted a final gesture to show that the cleanup on the roof of reactor number 3 was done. So they ordered 3 men to climb the chimney beside the destroyed reactor and plant a red flag on the top of it. The only way up was a 25-story spiral staircase, and everyone involved knew the radiation up there was still pretty high. Helicopter crews had already tried twice and had to turn back, so the job fell to 3 liquidators. Radiation specialist Alexander Yurchenko, who carried the flagpole, Valery Starodomov, who held the flag, and Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Sotnikov, who handled the radio and kept track of the time. They were told the whole thing needed to be wrapped up in 9 minutes. Any longer, and the dose they'd absorb would be dangerously high. The men made the climb, reached the top, and got the flag secured over the ruins of the reactor that had blown apart just months earlier. Then they came back down the same narrow staircase, knowing they just stood in one of the most radioactive spots on the planet. Once it was done, what did they get in return? A very Soviet reward. They each got a bottle of Pepsi, which was considered a rare treat at the time, and were given a single day off before returning to work. This is a pretty haunting image, even without context. A guy in a gas mask pushing a stroller. What's the story behind this one? Well, there's not a lot of detail to dive into, but it is exactly what it looks like. A liquidator wearing a gas mask and protective suit pushing a baby in a carriage. The child was found in an abandoned house in Tetsenki while the worker was measuring radiation during the cleanup. The village had been emptied after the disaster, and some people, like this infant, were somehow left behind. Workers had to go through deserted homes, streets, and villages, checking for radiation and making sure no one was still inside. In this case, someone was. This photo is from June of 1986. It's a Swedish farmer wearing a gas mask and a protective suit shoveling feed. Nothing about the scene looks all that dramatic at first glance, aside from, of course, him looking like he's cleaning up a toxic spill, which he basically was. The feed was contaminated by the radioactive cloud that drifted out of Chernobyl. He's not a scientist, he's not a cleanup worker, not someone stationed near the disaster. This is just a farmer. So it goes to show how widespread this disaster actually was. Radiation didn't just stay, over there. Countries hundreds of miles away had to toss out crops, quarantine livestock, and deal with contaminated soil and water. In case you needed some visual proof of the Chernobyl exclusion zone still being very dangerous, look at this photo taken in Prypiat in 2017. Here we see a Geiger counter next to a metal claw, reading 679,000 counts per minute. To put that in perspective, a normal background radiation level is usually around 20 to 50 counts per minute. Even a level of a few thousand per minute is considered dangerous for short-term exposure. exposure. 679,000? That's off the charts. That's enough to kill someone in minutes if exposed directly. This claw isn't just contaminated, it is extremely radioactive. But what exactly is the claw though? Here's a full view of it. The claw is a giant crane bucket, like a big mechanical scoop. It was used during the cleanup after Chernobyl to scoop up highly radioactive debris, things like graphite from the reactor core, concrete, and other fallout. After the cleanup, it was left in the forest near Prypiat, where it's now one of the most radioactive objects in the exclusion zone. Here we see a worker in full protective clothing and a mask handling boxes of vegetables in a landfill in Berlin. These vegetables had to be tossed because they were contaminated by radioactive fallout from Chernobyl. The crates are stacked on the ground and the workers sorting and moving them, making sure they're kept away from people. It's another photo that shows how far the disaster reached. The radioactive cloud traveled across Europe, landing on crops in other countries. Authorities had to act really fast, pulling food from stores, stopping it from being eaten, storing it in controlled landfills. Some of the most haunting images of worn down abandoned places you'll ever see have been taken in Prypiat. The amusement park is probably the most famous. It never actually opened. It was scheduled to launch just days after the Chernobyl disaster, so no one ever got to actually use it. Today, the Ferris wheel is still standing, rusted and motionless, with the empty frames of bumper cars and a carousel sitting nearby. Everything is decaying, rusted to hell, and completely frozen in time. Picnic tables and benches have been left empty, pathways are cracked, and weeds and small trees have started to take over the area. All this was designed for crowds. Spaces for families, areas for kids to play. It's hard, not to feel slightly somber looking at these images. Well, it doesn't get much more apocalyptic than this picture. In one of the schools in Prypiat, there's a room where the floor is just covered with gas masks. The filters have been looted by people looking for tiny bits of silver inside. What's weird though is that these masks were barely even used. A week before the disaster, students had been trained on how to put them on, but when the meltdown happened and people were being evacuated, they were told not to wear the masks. But why? Well, the communist leadership was worried that if people were told to put on gas masks, they'd panic, i.e. everyone would know there was a serious mess up. So to hell with people's health, the masks were all left behind. Prypiat Hospital, officially known as Hospital Number 126, treated people immediately after the Chernobyl disaster. In the hours following it, dozens of firefighters, plant workers, and first responders who were exposed to high doses of radiation were rushed here for urgent care. Their highly irradiated clothing was then hastily dumped in the hospital's basement, which is now one of the most dangerously contaminated areas in Prypiat. The most critical patients were later transferred to a specialist hospital in Moscow, but now 126 sits completely empty and decaying. Equipment sits rusting in the rooms, peeling paint flakes off the walls and the floors are cracked. Beds are still in the wards though, with some torn sheets or medical supplies left behind. The maternity ward, that's especially eerie. It's got cribs still sitting in place and some baby dolls on the floor. Operating rooms have surgical tools left out, and through all of it, nature has started creeping in through the broken windows. These eerie images were taken at one of Prypiat's kindergartens, left exactly as it was when the city was evacuated. The shelves are still filled with toys, some broken, dusty, but mostly intact. Cribs and small beds are scattered around, some with old dolls or stuffed animals still lying on them. The walls are peeling and faded pictures of animals and fairy tale scenes cover the walls. The place is right near the city center, so after the evacuation, nobody came back. At least not permanently. Outside, weeds and small trees are starting to creep in through the windows, and the flooring is cracked and decayed. Even decades later, nothing has been removed aside from the occasional looter. Looking at these images, it's a strange mix of ordinary and unsettling. Normal objects left behind, yet everything abandoned in a hurry. The Azure swimming pool in Prypiat is one of the more unusual abandoned spots you'll see photos of. It was built in the 70s, a large indoor pool, diving boards, changing rooms, a small gym area. After the disaster, the pool stayed open for a short bit, mainly for liquidators and plant workers to wash off contamination, but eventually it was of course completely abandoned. As you can probably tell, looking at it. The tiles are cracked, faded, and covered in dust. The pool's upper balcony and viewing areas are crumbling with broken railings and peeling paint. The diving boards hang rusted in place, and the pool is empty, exposing the floor underneath, giving the whole building, just like pretty much everywhere else in Prypiat, a post-apocalyptic vibe. Hotel Policia was one of the tallest buildings in Prypiat, a landmark of the city before the disaster. Built in the 70s, it was meant to host visitors to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, along with engineers and city officials. After the explosion, being that the building was so tall, it was actually pretty useful in the emergency response. The upper floors were used as makeshift observation points and temporary offices for the cleanup operations, and helicopters used the roof to coordinate flights in and out of the city. Today, the hotel is completely falling apart. The lobby's empty, with cracked floors and scattered debris everywhere. Broken furniture, elevator shafts are open and rusting, windows are shattered, and graffiti covers most of the walls. On the outside, the building still towers over Prypiat, but the place is deteriorating, with concrete crumbling and metal corroding. Chernobyl had already leaked radiation years before 1986, but every incident was buried. The plant's design flaws were flagged in secret reports, and when the explosion finally happened, Soviet news called it a minor accident, while entire families were outside breathing in fallout. These are disturbing secrets the Soviet Union hid about Chernobyl. Years before the meltdown, Soviet officials already knew the reactors at Chernobyl had dangerous flaws. Reports going all the way to Moscow flagged the RBMK-1000 design as unstable and missing some very important safety features. One of the biggest problems was how the reactor behaved when things didn't go perfectly. Instead of shutting down safely when power levels shifted, it could actually speed up the reaction. This would kind of be like having a car where pressing the brakes sometimes, just made it go faster. Would you ever step into a vehicle like that? Hell no. But, a bunch of nuclear reactors with the power to kill and contaminate everything in the surrounding area and disperse a radioactive cloud across large swaths of Europe? Hey, proceed. Even the emergency shutdown system was janky. The control rods, the things meant to stop the reaction in seconds, had graphite tips that caused a brief increase in power before lowering it. And that tiny delay could be enough for disaster to happen, which is exactly what happened during the 1986 test. On top of that, the reactors didn't have a proper containment dome, the kind of heavy shield you see at Western plants. Once the explosion happened, there was nothing keeping the radiation from going straight into the air, and all of this was written down in safety reviews, but the reports were buried. Acknowledging the flaws would have meant shutting down plants and losing money. And then accidents and emergencies started happening. The Chernobyl explosion in 1986 wasn't some freak accident out of nowhere. As I said, the Soviets already knew the plant was sketchy years before it blew up, and years later, there were declassified documents showing that back in 1982, there was already a radiation leak at the site. People nearby noticed strange illnesses, animals were dying off, but there was no official statement about this. The KGB said their priority was to stop, quote, panic and provocative rumors, which is a fancy way of saying lie to everyone. By 1983, Moscow already had reports labeling Chernobyl as one of the most dangerous nuclear plants in the entire Soviet Union because it lacked basic safety equipment. In 1984, there were more emergencies at the site, again hushed up. So when the 1986 meltdown happened, it was not totally out of the blue. There were years of ignored warnings that had piled up, and even after the reactor exploded, cover-ups kept coming. One of the biggest weapons the Soviet Union used after the explosion was propaganda. When radiation alarms started going off in Sweden and other countries, the Soviet government went on TV and said basically nothing had happened. Newspapers ran tiny, vague blurbs about it that didn't even mention the word explosion. On April 28th, 2 days after the blast, Soviet news finally admitted that there was an accident, but described it like a minor fire instead of, the worst nuclear disaster in history. At the same time, state-controlled media was pumping out stories about all the awesome stuff the Soviets were accomplishing. Sports wins, farming statistics, anything to distract from Chernobyl. Even when they couldn't hide it anymore, the language was carefully watered down. Instead of saying thousands exposed to radiation, this is really bad, people will be talking about this for the next several decades, they'd be like, it's no big deal, measures are being taken. Ordinary people living hundreds of miles away had no idea they were eating radioactive food and breathing fallout because the news refused to acknowledge how bad it was. Meanwhile, outside the USSR, scientists were publishing radiation readings that proved just how much the Soviets were lying, but more on that in a bit. When Reactor 4 exploded, the people living in Prypiat had no idea anything was wrong. Prypiat was a city built specifically for the plant's workers and their families, about 50,000 people. When Reactor 4 blew, radiation levels spiked immediately, but instead of getting people out, they told everyone to stay calm and carry on. So the next morning, kids went to school, parents went shopping, people were gardening and fishing while breathing in radioactive dust. The firefighters who rushed in weren't even told how bad it was, and most of them didn't have proper protective gear. By the time buses finally rolled in to take people away, 36 hours later, thousands of people had already been exposed to insane levels of radiation. When they left, they were told to pack light, like it was just for a weekend trip, but most never saw their homes again. Then all that time, the Soviet government was pretending to the outside world that nothing serious had even happened. When word of Chernobyl started to leak, pun intended, tourists and foreign workers inside Ukraine tried to get out. You'd think if the Soviets wanted to avoid attention, they'd quietly let people leave, but instead they locked things down. Train tickets were suddenly unavailable. There were reports of diplomats and foreign engineers being told there were just no seats available, even though half-empty trains were still running. Flights out of Kiev were heavily restricted, and some embassies had to fight to get their staff on planes. But why? Well, because letting a wave of foreigners flee all at once would have confirmed to the outside world that something really bad had happened. By trapping them in place, the Soviets tried to buy themselves time to control the story. Some foreigners later said they noticed soldiers quietly washing vehicles with hoses or strange military convoys moving through the night, but they weren't allowed to leave or ask questions. The irony is that by trying to contain the news this way, the Soviets, they just made everyone more suspicious, right? Other governments suddenly knew something was very wrong when their own citizens couldn't come home.
Coming in at our halfway point at number 5, we have a Chernobyl cover-up. In a documentary titled The Russian Woodpecker, Fyodor Alexandrovich explains a conspiracy theory that the Chernobyl blast was actually orchestrated to cover up the failure of the Russian woodpecker. Now, it wasn't a Russian bird or the Russian version of Woody the Woodpecker. The Russian woodpecker was actually an array radar that was meant to detect missiles before they were launched. The device was named after its woodpecker-like sound it would make during its operation. It cost 7 billion rubles and unfortunately did not work. It is suspected that it didn't work because of the northern lights messing with its signals, but it can't be for certain. So instead of suffering this terrible embarrassment, the Chernobyl plant that was known for its instability blew up, distracting everyone from the failure of the woodpecker. It's hard to say how likely all of this is, but when shooting the woodpecker documentary, apparently some pretty weird stuff happened to the documentary crew, such as visits from secret police services, as well as even one crew member being shot by a hidden sniper during the Euromaidan protests. Whatever the truth is here, it sounds like they were putting their nose where it wasn't wanted. At number 4, we have no containment building. Back in 1986, when the Chernobyl explosion actually happened, there was quite mysteriously no containment building that surrounded the reactors. Usually there are containment structures around radioactive places like the reactors located in Chernobyl. They are gas-tight structures that are usually made of steel reinforced concrete, so it can confine fission products that could release into the atmosphere during an accident if one were to happen. Sure enough, we all know that one happened here, and interestingly enough, it was not prepared for an accident that dangerous. According to author Richard Mueller of the book Physics for Future Presidents, The Science Behind the Headlines, if there would have been a containment unit around the reactors, Mueller believes that there would have been virtually no deaths. Interesting. I wonder if this coincides with any of the conspiracy of the Russian woodpecker as mentioned before. Maybe. Starting us off in our top 3, at number 3 we have alien saviors. In this case they quite literally came in peace. An eyewitness by the name of Mikhail Varitsky claimed to have seen a large fireball of light hovering above the reactor on the night of the explosion. Later on September 16th in 1989, apparently there was another huge radiation leak, and it is reported that this same ball of light was seen in the exact same spot once again. Many believe it to be aliens that were actually protecting us from the radioactive blast. Some claim that the blast was nowhere near as big as what it could have been, and that these aliens actually helped absorb and clean up whatever extra radiation information that they could to save us. You know me, I'm all about the alien theories, but I'm not sure about this one. I will say, many say similar events happened during the Fukushima accident as well. Oh well, aliens, if you are listening to me right now and you did help us, thank you. Now, show yourself. At number 2, we had the Blackbird of Chernobyl. In April of 1986, right before the explosion in July, many reported seeing a large creature that looked like a blackbird flying around Chernobyl. This creature was large with red glowing eyes and was compared to America's legend, the Mothman. Why? What's so similar between a large Mothman and a large blackbird? Well, both of these creatures had large glowing red eyes, as well as both showed up right before major events. The Mothman appeared and was spotted right before the Silver Bridge collapse in Point Pleasant, West Virginia in 1967, which reportedly killed 46 people. Some survivors of the Chernobyl blast reported seeing this giant scary creature fly away from the reactor after the blast. Many believe that this bird was a paranormal entity that was a harbinger of terrible things to come. Others believe it was just a large stork. I don't know what to believe here, but the idea of a giant paranormal creature that is similar to the one that was seen in the US 20 years before gives me goosebumps in the best way possible. I love monster and ghost lore, which is what brings us to our number 1 spot. And finally, coming in at number 1, we have my favorite, ghosts. That's right, not just named a ghost town because it's abandoned, but also because there are many different spirits that are said to be found here. Andrei Karsukov, a nuclear physicist from New York, told one story after his visit to the area back in 1997. Karsukov reports that he went to the power station one day at 7:30 a.m. and visited the number 4 reactor in the sarcophagus. You know, the big containment unit structure that they should have had on there before the explosion? Yeah, that thing. Well, he could not go inside due to the high levels of radiation, but once he was down there, he could hear screams coming from the inside due to a fire. So what did he do? He ran upstairs to the control room to get help, and once he barged open the door, he was told that he was the first person to open that door in 3 years. He was also told that the only way in was where he was, and if someone came in after him, they would have tripped the alarm.
There are tons of urban legends surrounding Chernobyl, from a mutated spider that killed 3 people in an apartment building in the Ukraine to the shadowy apparitions in abandoned buildings. These are unbelievable Chernobyl urban legends that might actually be true. We've all heard the stories about mutated animals in the Chernobyl exclusion zone. Turns out many of the animals do have odd mutations, but there's one urban legend about a mutated spider that takes things to a much more horrific level. After all, who would ever want to run into a mutated spider? Unless you thought you'd have a chance to turn out like Peter Parker, but that's not the case with this story. So a story about a killer mutant spider from Chernobyl was reported in a Turkish newspaper in 1990. 2 residents of an apartment in the Ukraine had been found in the elevator having suffered extreme loss of BLOOD, but none of it was found at the scene. It looked like it had been sucked out of them, as there were also 2 puncture wounds on their necks. People started to whisper tales about vampires stalking the building, and some residents got so scared that they avoided using the elevators completely. Then 2 detectives investigated. On the 3rd day of their investigation, the detectives were riding the elevator when it came to an abrupt stop between the 5th and 6th floors. Then the lights went out. Now at first they weren't too worried. The elevator was known to be pretty janky at times, but when they started hearing an ominous clicking noise coming from above their heads, they froze. What was this? Was it the predator? They removed one of the roof panels and shone their flashlights, only to see a foot-long black shape moving towards them. Suddenly it was on top of one of the detectives. His partner fired at it. When backup arrived, they found the detective cowering in a corner, a mutated spider across from him. When police explored the rest of the elevator shaft, they found the thing had laid eggs, which they burnt to a crisp with flamethrowers. Many people believe these monstrous spiders were born out of the Chernobyl disaster caused by radiation exposure that altered their genes. Were aliens involved in the Chernobyl disaster? Well, there's a conspiracy that says they very well may have been, but not in the way you're probably thinking. Instead of being blamed for the meltdown itself, extraterrestrial beings are rumored to have actually helped prevent an even worse catastrophe. The theory goes that when the disaster happened, aliens may have intervened to help contain the situation. Now, what is this actually based on? Well, nothing. One eyewitness, Mikhail Varitsky, reported seeing a strange fiery ball of light hovering above the reactor during the night of the accident. He described it as a glowing orb that hung in the air for a few minutes. In his exact words, "I and other people from my team went to the site of the blast at night. We saw a ball of fire and it was slowly flying in the sky. I think the ball was 6 or 8 meters in diameter. Then we saw 2 rays of crimson light stretching towards the 4th unit. The object was some 300 meters from the reactor. The event lasted for about 3 minutes. The lights of the object went out and it flew away in the northwestern direction." End quote. Some people think this may have been an alien craft, and this wasn't the only sighting either. There had apparently been a number of UFO sightings in the sky in the days leading up to the accident, so were extraterrestrials helping to manage the radiation and prevent it from spreading uncontrollably? Did the Bible predict the Chernobyl disaster? Well, some interpret a passage from the book of Revelation to be pretty eerily accurate to the events. There's a passage that talks about a great star falling from the sky and poisoning the water, and that star is called wormwood. Well, in Russian, Chernobyl translates to wormwood, which has led many to think the Bible was somehow foreshadowing the disaster. The exact passage goes as follows: "And the third angel sounded the trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, burning as it were a torch, and it fell on the third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood, and the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter." Now, aside from the wormwood thing, there are other similarities here. Firefighters at Chernobyl described the fires at Reactor 4 as burning like a torch, just like in the scripture, and the part about bitter waters could definitely be interpreted as the radiation seeping into local water, making it unsafe to drink. There's even a sculpture near Chernobyl showing an angel with a trumpet, created by a Ukrainian artist as a tribute to the firefighters and workers who risked their lives during the crisis. Up next, we have the tale of the scream. So in 1997, a nuclear physicist named Andrei Korsakov from the University of Buffalo had an eerie experience at the Chernobyl power plant. While visiting the site of Reactor 4, he reported hearing a faint but frantic voice screaming for help as he was taking radiation readings in the infamous Ground Zero area at around 7:30 in the morning. Now, after hearing the screams, Korsakov rushed back upstairs to tell the personnel what he heard, but to his shock, they told him that he was the first person to enter that restricted area in 3 years. The security protocols were strict, too. Entry required a password, handprint scan, and any unauthorized presence would trigger a whole whackload of alarms. So, who had been screaming?
Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot we have the disaster. We talk a lot about Chernobyl, but how often do we really discuss how this disaster actually happened in the first place? What actually went on that caused it? The Chernobyl nuclear disaster occurred on April 26, 1986 in Ukraine, which at the time was a part of the Soviet Union. During a routine safety test, a series of errors and design flaws led to an explosion in Reactor 4 of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The explosion caused a massive fire that released radioactive material into the atmosphere, which was carried by wind across Ukraine, Belarus, and other parts of Europe. The disaster was caused by a combination of factors, including a flawed reactor design, a lack of safety, and human error. During the safety test, the reactor's power output dropped to dangerously low levels, leading to an attempt to restore power that resulted in a sudden surge. This caused the reactor to overheat, leading to a steam explosion that destroyed the reactor's upper structure. The accident caused immediate deaths due to the explosion, as well as long-term health effects from exposure to radiation. The Chernobyl disaster remains the worst nuclear accident in history in terms of the number of deaths and the environmental impact. It led to significant changes in nuclear safety regulations and increased awareness of the potential risks of nuclear power. In our number 9 spot today, we have the operator. This story is one that comes directly from Alexei Brius, who is a control room operator at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and this is his story of the day of the disaster, which starts as he was traveling on a bus to work on April 26, 1986, knowing nothing of the historic disaster that occurred just hours before. As he arrived, he thought, quote, "It looked like it would be a mass grave. I was sure that the whole night shift had died there." He continued on to say, quote, "At the moment of the explosion, I was in Prypiat in my flat. I was sleeping sleeping tightly, I didn't hear, I didn't see anything. In the morning, I was to go to work, and so I did. I knew nothing about the disaster, I just got on a bus and went to work. As I was coming close to the station, I saw from the bus that the block was destroyed. I always say that my hair stood on its end when I saw that. I didn't understand why me and other workers were brought there, but it turned out that there was still much work to be done. Me and my coworkers got off the bus and tried to enter the territory of the 4th block as we were supposed to. There was a guard wearing a rubber-coated army suit who had orders not to let anyone in. Finally, they agreed. The guarding sergeant gave us each a pill of potassium iodide. I took it immediately. It was a special medicine made to protect the thyroid gland from radiation. All my life, I remember him with gratitude. The upper part of the reactor and the separator barrel were open. The main circulating pump was seen from the outside. Down the reactor, I saw the reactor's emergency cooling system all ruined. Its pieces were mixed with slabs of concrete. I was stepping over lumps of black graphite. I didn't want to admit what I saw, just like many other people, that it was black graphite. Alexei goes on to explain that he and the other operators had to, quote, save those injured by fire, debris, hot water, and steam and radiation. We were to find them, carry them out, and deliver them to the medical personnel and go look for others. We saved and brought everybody out except for one person. He is still somewhere there inside the reactor. In our number 8 spot today, you know, a bit of a bit of a break in the really dark story, we have cows. Alright, cows can cheer anybody up. The area around Chernobyl was known for its agriculture before the disaster, so of course that means there were definitely a lot of cows that could be found. While many people who were forced to evacuate had to leave their animals behind, since farm animals are not only expensive but can also be used as a source of income, many people took their farm animals with them. Unfortunately, however, many of these animals had already been exposed to the radiation in some capacity, and while it didn't affect them right away, the newer generations saw much more of the effects. In 1989, many farmers began reporting birth defects in their animals, some being much more severe than others. As time went on, the cows became less mutated, but that doesn't mean the effects went away. As the cows continued to graze on feed that was contaminated, the effects became more internal. This has led to completely normal-looking cows near the exclusion zone to begin producing milk that is toxic and not fit for consumption. While some of the outside and more visible effects of the radiation has worn off, there are still many unseen effects that continue to be prevalent today. In our number 7 spot today, we have the Liquidators. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, Soviet authorities sent in robots to help with the cleanup efforts in the most hazardous areas. This was an amazing idea until the robots quickly became damaged or destroyed by the high levels of radiation in the environment. The robots faced several challenges, including damage to their electronic components and problems with their movement systems. The high levels of radiation also made it difficult for the robots to function, as the radiation would interfere with the robots' sensors and their controls. Of course, with robots out of the picture, humans were the ones who continued with the cleanup efforts. Known as Liquidators, these people were primarily Soviet military personnel, firefighters, and volunteers who were tasked with containing the radioactive material and preventing further contamination, and they faced extreme danger and were exposed to high levels of radiation. Many of these people were working without proper protective gear and in close proximity to the highly radioactive material. Despite these dangers, the Liquidators worked tirelessly to contain the disaster and prevent further harm. Many of the Liquidators suffered from acute radiation sickness, with symptoms including nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. Long-term health effects including cancer and other illnesses have also been reported among the Liquidators. The Liquidators played a very vital role in preventing further harm from the Chernobyl disaster, and they are often referred to as heroes for their bravery and their sacrifice. Many have received recognition and awards for their efforts, but many continue to suffer from the long-term health effects of their exposure to the radiation. In our number 6 spot today, we have the abandoned amusement park. The Prypiat amusement park, located in the town of Prypiat in Ukraine, was set to open on May 1st, 1986, just days after the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. The park was intended to be a celebration of the town's prosperity and the Soviet Union's technological achievements, but it never opened its doors to the public due to the disaster. The park features a Ferris wheel, bumper cars, a carousel, and other rides which still stand today as an eerie reminder of the town's abandoned past. The Ferris wheel is particularly haunting, with rusted and decaying carts. The amusement park was never fully completed and its rides were never tested or operated, and today it serves as a chilling symbol of the devastating impact of the Chernobyl disaster on the town and its people. Despite the danger posed by the high levels of radiation in the area, the Prypiat amusement park has become a popular destination for tourists seeking to witness the haunting beauty of the abandoned rides and the town itself.
In 1996, a researcher named Vitaly Prypiat looked into the possibility of the accident having been caused by an earthquake. People were pretty skeptical though. Experts pointed out over 80 discrepancies in his report, but then in 1997, a group of scientists from the United Institute of the Physics of the Earth took another look into this. They found that on the night of April 25th to the 26th, just 16 seconds before the reactor exploded, 3 nearby geological stations recorded a weak seismic event. So did an earthquake cause this disaster? And if so, was it natural, or was there a possibility that it was intentional? Sounds crazy, but the idea of weaponized earthquakes isn't entirely out of the realm of possibility. During the Cold War, there were rumors that both the Soviet Union and the US were researching tectonic weapons. We don't know for sure if these weapons were actually ever developed or used, but some think they may have been, of course, in secret. I mean, even Nikola Tesla claimed to have created a device in 1898 that could produce earthquake-like effects. An article in Pravda, the former Soviet newspaper, claimed in 1992 that geophysical weapons were indeed developed, but the government denied this. Another conspiracy has to do with the KGB. The idea is that they wanted to sabotage Reactor 4 to scare other countries away from building their own nuclear power plants. The goal? To monopolize Europe's energy market entirely. The thinking goes like this: if Chernobyl created massive fear about nuclear energy, countries in Western and Central Europe would maybe think twice before investing in their own nuclear facilities. With limited energy sources in Europe, the KGB figured that if they could make these countries dependent on Soviet oil and gas, they'd be in a position of power. Of course, if you're going to look at the KGB having something to do with the incident, it's only natural for others to speculate about the US government as well. Ever since the disaster took place in 1986, there were suspicions that the CIA might have had something to do with it, which is not surprising in the slightest. This one's pretty obvious. The idea is that the CIA orchestrated the explosion at Reactor 4 to create fear around nuclear energy and destabilize the USSR's influence. It was a tense period of time for the Soviets and the United States, and by creating a catastrophic event like this, the CIA could not only undermine the Soviet government's credibility, but also discourage other nations from developing nuclear power themselves, giving them the edge in the global energy market. Some were also highly skeptical of the rapid response of the US, thinking that they could have had a prior knowledge of the disaster. Now into more paranormal stuff. Like with any ghost town, especially one abandoned for such a tragic reason, ghost stories are plentiful. The amusement park has to be one of the eeriest spots in Prypiat. It was built just days before the disaster. It was meant to be a place of fun for families, but that never came to be. Sadly, it was never officially opened to the public, but legend has it that if you happen to be exploring Prypiat late at night, you may hear the faint sounds of laughter and music coming from the park. Visitors have reported strange occurrences while exploring. Some people say that when they approach the bumper cars, they can faintly hear the sounds of engines starting. Another creepy part about the park, and really the whole town itself, are the dolls scattered throughout it. Dolls that were left behind, now left to decay. Some believe that these dolls, especially those found in the carousel area, have taken on a life of their own. People have claimed that the dolls seem to change positions or appear in places they weren't before, but the giant rusted Ferris wheel is the most recognizable sight in the park. Some have said that when the wind blows, the wheel creaks and groans, sounding almost like whispers. It's not just the amusement park that's said to be haunted though. Urban explorers have reported seeing dark figures darting between buildings all throughout the city of Prypiat, especially in the empty schools and hospitals. Could these shadowy figures be the spirits of those who died in the disaster, still trapped in the abandoned city they once lived and worked in, forever doomed to roam the desolate streets? Some will say they've seen unexplained silhouettes peering out at them from corners of rooms or appearing just out of the corner of their eye. But are there actually shadowy entities trapped in the Chernobyl exclusion zone, or could people just be seeing things? either from psyching themselves out or having actual illusions brought on by the radioactivity. Now, the Black Bird of Chernobyl is probably the eeriest urban legend surrounding the Chernobyl disaster. The Black Bird of Chernobyl is a creepy urban legend that's come about in the years since the nuclear disaster in '86, but residents claimed to have seen the creature in the days leading up to it. It's often described as a big, dark figure, an enormous black owl or raven looking thing. People claim to have spotted it flying around the Chernobyl power plant in the days leading up to the explosion. Not only that, but residents began having these horrific, vivid nightmares about it after spotting it. So what was this thing and why was it there? Well, the main theory is that the creature was an entity acting as a bad omen, a warning of the disaster to come, very similar to Mothman showing up in the Silver Bridge right before it collapsed. Some even think the Black Bird of Chernobyl and Mothman are the exact same creature. So what do you all think?